It was a gray Thursday morning when Karen Mitchell signed her name for the last time beside the man she once believed she'd grow old with. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cold paper. A sterile silence hung in the air like the aftermath of a storm. She had spent 22 years learning the language of compromise, of patience, of small sacrifices that kept a marriage standing. But that morning, all she heard was the scratch of pens and the rustle of legal envelopes closing on what was once her forever. Outside the courthouse, the sky was swollen with rain. She stood beneath it without opening her umbrella, letting the drizzle soak through her hair and coat as if it could wash the years off her shoulders. There was no shouting, no scene, just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, but exposes. She felt invisible to a city that kept moving while her world ended in slow motion. At 48, Karen found herself standing at the threshold of a life she didn't recognize. The house they built was sold, the friends they shared divided, and the laughter that once filled the mornings was replaced by the hum of loneliness. Her reflection in the mirror seemed older overnight. Her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had been brave for too long. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a single cup of tea, staring at a candle flickering in the dark. The walls of her rented apartment were bare, but her mind was full of memories she wanted to forget and questions she couldn't answer. "What now, God?" she whispered. It wasn't anger. It was surrender, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to control. On the table lay her wedding ring, still warm from her hand. She remembered the moment she took it off earlier that day, feeling the ghost of its weight long after it was gone. The ring had been a circle, a symbol of eternity. But eternity, she realized, is not always shared. Sometimes it begins again within. As the candlelight trembled, she felt something strange rise inside her. Not hope yet, but space. Space for air, for questions, for something new to exist. It was then that her eyes fell upon a notebook she hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with old lesson plans, quotes, and scribbles from when she was still teaching English literature at the small-town school. Between the lines of Shakespeare and Frost, she found one verse underlined so many times the paper had thinned. "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Romans 12:2. The words seemed to lift from the page and breathe into her emptiness. She read them again and again until the sound became a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Renewing, not erasing, not pretending. Renewing. For the first time, she wondered if faith wasn't about starting over, but about remembering who she was before she forgot. In the days that followed, the silence of her apartment became a kind of classroom. She began listening to sermons while she cleaned, podcasts while she walked, and audiobooks that spoke about faith and the mind. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she heard a man named Dr. Joe Dispenza say something that caught her breath. "Your personality creates your personal reality." She paused, letting the sentence echo through her chest. If her outer world reflected her inner state, then maybe the life she lost was not punishment. It was reflection. That thought both terrified and liberated her. She stayed up that night writing in her notebook. "If I can create from fear, I can also create from faith." A few days later, she found herself at the library, searching for something she couldn't name. She left with a worn copy of The Power of the Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy, and a book by Rhonda Byrne that her daughter had once called too optimistic. Karen smiled at the irony. Optimism was a luxury she thought she could no longer afford. But that night, sitting cross-legged on her floor, she began to read, and something ancient stirred inside her, the belief that thought, when aligned with faith, could move mountains. She started small. Each morning, before reaching for her phone, she placed her hand over her heart and said quietly, "Thank you, God, for the life I'm creating." She didn't know what that life looked like, but the words gave her direction when everything else felt uncertain. Gratitude became her anchor, even when tears fell into her coffee. Sometimes, while walking through the park, she would notice small signs, the sudden warmth of sunlight after a week of rain, a stranger's smile, a feather on the ground. She didn't know if they were messages, but she began to see them as reminders that she wasn't abandoned. Still, there were nights when the loneliness screamed louder than her faith. Nights when she missed the weight of another body beside hers, when she questioned if starting over at this age was naive. But even then, she would hear her pastor's words from years ago. When God removes something, it's never loss, it's pruning. And so, she began to let go. One drawer at a time, one memory at a time. She donated her wedding china, gave away the dresses she wore to dinners that now lived only in photographs, and filled her shelves with candles, journals, and books that made her soul feel seen. In her journal, she wrote one sentence every day: "I am learning to see myself as God already sees me." The world outside didn't change overnight. Bills still came. Some friends disappeared. But inside her, something was forming. A quiet strength, an invisible alignment. The same woman who once begged for closure was now learning the language of surrender. Weeks later, she found herself in a small bookstore downtown. A soft piano played in the background, and the scent of cinnamon tea lingered in the air. She picked up a journal with the words, "Start Anywhere," engraved on the cover. She smiled and whispered, "I will." That evening, she sat again at her table, the same candle flickering, but this time its light didn't feel fragile. She opened the journal and wrote the title on the first page: "Divorced at 48, Empowered at 53. She didn't know why she wrote it. It felt premature, even foolish, but her hand kept moving, guided by something beyond logic. 5 years from now, she wrote, I will look back and thank this version of me for not giving up. She leaned back, exhaling softly, a tear rolling down her cheek. The candle flame danced higher, and in that moment, Karen realized something profound. Endings are only visible to the eyes that have not yet seen the new beginning forming behind them. As the clock struck midnight, she whispered, I'm ready, Lord. Teach me how to begin again. And somewhere between the silence and her faith, heaven listened. The first morning after the divorce, Karen woke to the sound of nothing. Not the kettle whistling, not the news humming from the living room, not the deep voice that used to say, Morning, love. Only silence, and the hum of the refrigerator echoing through the kitchen like a ghost that refused to leave. The apartment smelled faintly of paint and cardboard. Boxes were stacked against the wall, each one labeled in her neat handwriting. Books, linens, old photos. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the small window overlooking a quiet street. The morning light touched her face with the kind of tenderness she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, she didn't move. The stillness was unfamiliar but sacred, as if the universe had paused to let her breathe again. When she reached for the sugar, she found herself whispering, Thank you. It came out before she could stop it. She wasn't sure who she was thanking, God, fate, or the tiny part of herself that hadn't given up. But the words filled the air with something different. Gratitude. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but transforms it. Later that morning, she opened her Bible to where she had left the ribbon days before. Her eyes fell on Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? She read it out loud, her voice trembling. A new thing. It felt impossible, yet something in her chest flickered with recognition. That afternoon, she took a walk through the park near her building. Children were laughing. An old man fed pigeons, and a woman jogged past her with headphones. Everything looked ordinary, but Karen saw it differently now. She felt as though life itself was whispering, I'm not done with you yet. That night, she couldn't sleep. The empty side of the bed reminded her of absence. She lay there staring at the ceiling, until she finally got up and went into the kitchen. The moonlight spilled through the blinds, bathing the floor in silver. She sat at the table with her journal open, the same one that now held her declaration, empowered at 53. She ran her fingers over the words and smiled faintly. Maybe this is how faith begins, she murmured, not with certainty, but with curiosity. She remembered something she had heard from Bob Proctor in an old seminar video. Faith and fear both demand you believe in something you cannot see. You choose. That line settled deep inside her. Fear had been her compass for too long. Every decision she had made in the last decade was designed to avoid loss, but loss had come anyway, and it had stripped her of everything that wasn't essential. She began writing again. If fear builds walls, then faith builds doors. I want doors. The following Sunday, she walked into a small church near downtown. The congregation was small, maybe 30 people, but their singing filled the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. The pastor spoke about the renewal of the mind, quoting Romans 12:2, the same verse that had found her weeks before. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness but recognition. The message wasn't coincidence, it was confirmation. After service, a woman named Grace, gray-haired, bright-eyed, approached her with a smile. First time here? She asked. Karen nodded. It's been a while. Grace handed her a card with a phone number and said, We have a women's prayer group on Thursdays. No pressure. Just hearts learning to hope again. Karen thanked her, slipping the card into her bag, unsure if she'd ever use it. But that night, she found herself holding it between her fingers while the rain tapped softly against the window. There was something about the way Grace had said learning to hope again that stayed with her. The days that followed unfolded slowly. She began a morning ritual, lighting a candle, brewing coffee, and reading a few pages of The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. She underlined one line in red ink: "You are the masterpiece of your own life." She looked at it for a long time, whispering, "Then it's time I pick up the brush." She started practicing small acts of faith. She spoke kindly to her reflection in the mirror. She wrote gratitude lists even when nothing seemed worth listing. She replaced the phrase, "I can't," with, "I'm learning." She didn't realize it, but she was rewiring her brain, creating new neural pathways of belief, just as Dr. Joe Dispenza described in his lectures. At first it felt forced. Pretending to believe felt like lying. But as weeks passed, something subtle shifted. She noticed herself humming while doing the dishes, laughing at old movies, even standing taller when she walked down the street. Faith wasn't erasing her past. It was restoring her perception of the present. One evening, she returned from the grocery store and found the sky ablaze with color, orange, pink, and gold, melting into the horizon. She stood on the balcony, mesmerized. This is what it looks like when God paints healing, she thought. As she leaned against the railing, she remembered another quote she had copied into her notebook. "Change your thoughts, and you change your world." Joseph Murphy. She whispered it softly, letting the words mingle with the wind. That night, she cooked a simple dinner for one: pasta, garlic bread, and a glass of red wine. As she sat at the small wooden table, candle flickering beside her, she smiled through tears. For the first time in years, she wasn't eating in silence. She was dining in peace. When she finished, she closed her eyes and said a prayer of thanks, not for what she had lost, but for what she was becoming. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. "Thank you for the quiet. Thank you for the space between what was and what will be. Thank you for the echo that reminds me you're still here." The clock ticked softly in the background. The kitchen, once a place of loneliness, had become a sanctuary. Every sound seemed to carry meaning now. The hum of the fridge, the clink of a cup, the soft breath between words. She realized that God doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes he speaks in stillness. Before going to bed, she opened her journal again and wrote, "Faith isn't loud. It's a whisper that keeps me standing when nothing else does." The next morning, sunlight flooded the room. She stood by the window with her coffee, watching people pass below. Life hadn't changed drastically, but something in her had. She felt lighter, more open, as if a divine current was quietly steering her toward something unseen but certain. And as she turned to start her day, she whispered the same words that had begun this chapter of her life: "Thank you." It began one quiet afternoon in late September. The air carried that faint autumn crispness, the smell of rain mixed with the distant warmth of someone's fireplace. Karen sat on the floor surrounded by open books, her journal, and a half-empty cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold hours ago. The candle on the table had burned down to a small pool of wax, yet its fragrance, vanilla and cedarwood, still lingered softly in the air. Her world was simple now, stripped of noise and clutter, but simplicity had made room for something new, something alive. She was no longer surviving her days. She was beginning to notice them. The sound of her pen gliding across the paper, the hum of the refrigerator, even the steady rhythm of her own breathing felt like a kind of prayer. That morning, she had written a single sentence in the center of the page: "Renewal begins with awareness." She didn't know where the phrase came from, perhaps from a sermon, a podcast, or simply the whisper of her own soul. But the words felt true. Later that day, she opened her laptop and played a video that had appeared in her YouTube recommendations. Dr. Joe Dispenza, How to Reprogram the Mind. She listened, leaning forward, her hands wrapped around her mug. He spoke of the brain's ability to change, of neurons that fire and wire together, of how thought alone can sculpt a new reality. Karen paused the video, staring at the reflection of her own face on the screen. Could faith and science be saying the same thing? She thought of Romans 12:2 again. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It struck her that God had written this truth long before modern science had the tools to measure it. That realization felt electric. It was as though heaven itself confirmed what her heart had always known. Transformation wasn't magic. It was divine design. She sat there for a long time, the laptop screen fading into sleep mode, the only light now coming from the flickering candle beside her. She whispered into the stillness, "Then I can change. I will change." From that moment, her mornings took on new meaning. She began each day in silence, not asking, not pleading, simply being. She'd sit by the window with her journal and write 3 things she was grateful for, no matter how small: the sound of birds, the warmth of her blanket, the courage to face the day. Gratitude became her new language. At first her thoughts wandered, old memories intruded, arguments, disappointments, fears, but she learned not to fight them. She breathed through them, letting each exhale carry a quiet prayer. Slowly she began to notice space between her thoughts, a stillness she had never experienced before. It was in that stillness that she felt something stir, like a seed splitting open underground, not visible, but alive. One evening, while watching the sunset from her balcony, she remembered something Bob Proctor had said: "When you change your paradigm, everything else follows." The phrase echoed as she watched the sky turn to gold, then to rose. Change didn't begin with action. It began with identity. If she was still living as the woman who had been abandoned, no amount of effort could create the life of the woman who had been reborn. She closed her eyes and said softly, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Her transformation wasn't dramatic. It was steady, quiet, sacred. She changed what she consumed. She stopped watching the news that fed fear. She replaced it with worship music, faith-based audiobooks, and teachings about the subconscious mind. Her evenings were now spent writing affirmations, not to manifest wealth or status, but peace. She read Joseph Murphy's words until they felt engraved in her mind. Whatever you impress on your subconscious mind is expressed on the screen of space. To her, that was no longer theory. It was truth. Each thought was a seed, and her life was the garden. She began planting differently. One night, the power went out during a thunderstorm. The apartment was dark except for flashes of lightning illuminating the walls. Instead of fear, she felt calm. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, listening to the rain against the glass. The scent of wet earth filled the room, and she realized that storms, too, were part of renewal. She whispered a verse she had once underlined in her Bible: "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." At John 1-5, the words vibrated through her like warmth, spreading through cold skin. In the weeks that followed, the change inside her began to mirror the world around her. She started noticing synchronicities: an old friend calling out of the blue, a job opportunity mentioned at the exact moment she'd been praying for provision, finding the exact book she needed at a thrift store. None of it felt random. It felt orchestrated. One morning, while journaling, she wrote, "Miracles don't always look miraculous. Sometimes they look like timing." Her neighbors began to notice her glow. Even the barista at the cafe down the street greeted her differently, sensing something had shifted. And maybe it had. The frequency of her heart had changed. Faith was no longer a distant hope, but a daily vibration. That evening, as she closed her journal, she ran her fingers over the candlelight's shadow dancing on the pages. The flame's reflection flickered like an echo of her own transformation. For the first time in years, she didn't feel broken. She felt becoming. Before going to bed, she stood by the mirror, her reflection softened by lamplight. She smiled, not because life was perfect, but because she had learned to see perfection in the process. "Thank you, God," she whispered, "for the renewal I can't yet see but already feel." And in that whispered prayer, the seed of her new life pushed quietly upward, through faith, through surrender, through the soil of her old self, toward the light. The mornings had become sacred. Karen no longer reached for her phone when she opened her eyes. Instead, she lay still, listening to the soft hum of the city waking outside her window, the distant whir of traffic, the bark of a dog, the rhythm of life beginning again. She would breathe deeply, counting slowly, feeling her heartbeat steady beneath her palm. It was a ritual now, a daily conversation between her soul and her Creator. Each morning began with a whisper: "Renew my mind, Lord." She had read in one of Joe Dispenza's books that the brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and experience. When you visualize with emotion, the brain begins to believe it's already true. To Karen, it felt like science had simply found language for what faith had always known. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So she practiced believing before seeing. Her mornings were spent journaling and visualizing, not in desperation, but in peace. She wrote down what she desired, as if it were already unfolding. I live in abundance. I walk in peace. I love and am loved deeply. I serve with purpose. At first, the words felt foreign, like trying on a dress that didn't quite fit, but each repetition softened the resistance. The sentences began to sound less like fiction and more like memory. She could feel her body responding, the warmth in her chest, the calm in her breathing. It was as if her soul recognized the truth before her mind caught up. She brewed coffee and let its aroma fill the room. The rich, earthy scent wrapped around her like comfort. She would sip it slowly while sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains, painting golden patterns across the table. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine that light moving through her, cleansing, healing, restoring. One morning, she wrote a phrase that would become her anchor. My faith programs my frequency. It came to her as if whispered from somewhere higher. She underlined it twice and added beneath it a verse she'd read the night before. Let the weak say, I am strong. Galantir 10. The power of declaration, she realized, was not about ignoring reality. It was about giving her faith a voice. Words were instructions to the subconscious mind, and the subconscious was the bridge between prayer and manifestation. Karen remembered what Bob Proctor had said in one of his teachings. If you can hold it in your mind, you can hold it in your hand. It made her smile. For years she had prayed with her lips, but doubted with her mind. Now she was learning to let her thoughts agree with her prayers. Every night, she practiced something new, a mental rehearsal of the life she desired. She would close her eyes and see herself walking through a home filled with light, hosting women's gatherings, laughing freely, feeling whole. She imagined the smell of lavender in the air, the sound of music in the background, the soft touch of her granddaughter's hand in hers, and she wouldn't stop at imagining. She would feel it. Gratitude would rise in her chest until tears filled her eyes. In that emotional state, she knew she was speaking to the divine in the only language heaven truly understood, faith. It wasn't easy. The old thoughts still visited her like unwanted guests. Doubt would whisper, who do you think you are? Or, you're too old to start again. But she learned to answer those voices. I am who God says I am, she'd whisper back. And he's not finished with me yet. There were days when her faith wavered. The bills still came. The loneliness still crept in at night. But something in her had changed. She no longer collapsed under it. She observed the fear, breathed through it, and chose again. As Rhonda Byrne had written, what you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. What you imagine, you create. She began to walk differently, shoulders back, steps lighter. Even her reflection seemed to carry a quiet confidence. When she passed strangers on the street, she smiled genuinely. Her energy was changing, and people could feel it. At church, Grace, the woman she'd met on her first visit, noticed the difference immediately. You're glowing, Karen, she said after service, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Karen laughed softly. Maybe I'm just learning to stop dimming the light God gave me. That night, she reflected on that conversation while standing by her window. The city lights shimmered below like scattered stars. She thought about the teachings she had gathered from books, sermons, and long talks with God. All of them led to one truth. Transformation was not a moment. It was a decision repeated daily. She sat down at her desk and wrote another affirmation. Every time I choose gratitude over fear, I rewire my destiny. The candle flame beside her danced with each exhale, casting soft shadows against the wall. She traced her finger through the warm wax that had dripped onto the table, thinking how even melted things could still give light. That was her life now, something once broken, still shining in new form. Over the next weeks, small confirmations began to appear. Unexpected checks in the mail, invitations to speak at women's gatherings, a publisher who asked if she'd ever considered writing her story. None of it felt accidental. It was as if heaven had been waiting for her agreement. She remembered a quote from Joseph Murphy that she had copied into her journal. Change your conception of yourself, and you will automatically change the world in which you live. That line became her meditation. She understood now that she didn't need to fight for her future. She needed to align with it. One Sunday evening, as rain tapped softly on the windows, she made herself a cup of tea and turned off the lights. Sitting in the glow of a single lamp, she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me that miracles are not events. They're frequencies." The air in the room felt charged, alive, almost electric. A stillness settled over her heart, the kind that carried both peace and anticipation. For the first time, she truly believed. Not because of what she saw, but because of who she was becoming. And as she drifted to sleep that night, she knew her mind was no longer her enemy. It had become the soil where faith was taking root. And from that soil, everything else would bloom. The change inside Karen had been quiet, but now the quiet began to tremble. Transformation, she was learning, isn't only about light. It's about meeting the shadows that come to resist it. It began one afternoon while she was preparing lunch. The radio played softly in the background, sunlight pouring across the kitchen counter. The smell of olive oil and herbs filled the air, yet her mind wasn't present. A sudden wave of sadness hit her out of nowhere, so heavy she had to set down the knife and grip the counter to steady herself. It felt like grief returning uninvited, wearing a new face. Old thoughts surfaced, familiar and cruel. You're too old to start again. You're pretending. You'll never be enough. Her chest tightened. She turned off the stove, sat down at the table, and stared at the steam rising from the pot. "Why now?" she whispered. It was as if all the affirmations, all the prayers, all the progress had crumbled in one moment of doubt. That's when she remembered something Joe Dispenza had said. The moment you decide to change, the body and mind fight to stay the same. That resistance is not failure. It's proof that transformation has begun. She exhaled, eyes closed. Then maybe this pain is proof I'm doing something right. She stood up, lit a candle, and sat on the floor. The flame flickered against the walls, shadows moving like old memories. The scent of wax and lavender drifted through the room as she began to breathe deeply, hands resting on her knees. In the stillness, she felt the pull of two worlds, the old Karen clinging to the familiar pain, and the new one daring to believe she was worthy of joy. Faith, she realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act differently, even while fear screamed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the city murmured outside. The thoughts came in waves, memories of her ex-husband, of promises broken, of the years she had lost, trying to be someone else's peace while losing her own. Anger rose, then shame, then sorrow. She wanted to pray but didn't know what to say. Finally, she whispered, "God, if you're still here, teach me how to stop fighting myself." A verse from Psalms surfaced in her memory, soft but clear. "Be still, and know that I am God." A Psalm 46:10. The words didn't erase the pain, but they steadied it. She turned on the bedside lamp and opened her journal. Across the page she wrote, "This is not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough in disguise." The next morning she woke before sunrise. The air was cool, the sky still a pale gray. She wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out onto the balcony. The faint scent of rain lingered in the breeze. As she watched the city stretch into day, she thought about something Bob Proctor had once said, "Discipline is remembering what you want." Karen realized that faith, too, was a form of discipline. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a daily commitment to remember truth even when emotions forgot. So she returned to her practices, journaling, gratitude, stillness. But this time, she returned to her practices, journaling, gratitude, stillness. But this time, it wasn't peaceful. Every word she wrote felt like swimming against a current. The pen trembled slightly in her hand. She wasn't writing to affirm anymore. She was writing to survive. Her prayers had changed tone, too. Less polished, more raw. "God, help me not to sink in my own mind," she whispered one evening, staring at the candle that had burned down to nothing but smoke. The war inside her was not visible, but it was real. It happened in moments, when she hesitated before sending a job application, when she looked at her reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back, when her heart wanted to hope, but her mind replayed every reason she shouldn't. That voice of fear was cunning, logical, familiar. It spoke in sentences she once believed were truth, yet beneath that noise, something quieter began to whisper back. "You are not who you used to be." The two voices clashed like thunder and wind, one rooted in memory, the other in faith. She remembered reading Joseph Murphy late one night, underlining a single line, "Your subconscious mind accepts what you feel to be true." Those words haunted her. If that was true, then every fearful thought was a seed, and she had spent years planting storms. Now she was learning how to sow peace, one thought at a time. On the 7th morning of that difficult week, she woke before dawn. The air in her room was cold, her body tense. For a moment she wanted to give in, to cancel her plans, to crawl back under the covers, to believe she had imagined all her progress. But a deeper impulse pushed her up. She made coffee, wrapped herself in her robe, and sat by the window. Outside, the city was still asleep. Streetlights glowed faintly through the fog, and a bird began to sing somewhere in the distance. The scent of coffee filled the room, grounding her. She opened her Bible and found herself in Isaiah again. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Isaiah 43:2. Tears came quietly. Not from pain this time, but from recognition. She wasn't being punished. She was being purified. This wasn't the absence of God. It was the presence of growth. By mid-morning, she felt something shift. She sat at her desk and began writing what she called declarations for renewal. Each sentence was both science and scripture, a reprogramming of her soul. I am guided, even when I feel lost. My mind serves my spirit, not the other way around. I am not at war with my past. I am learning from it. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead lives in me. She said them out loud, her voice trembling at first, then growing steadier. She could almost feel new neural pathways forming as she spoke, thoughts bending toward faith like sunflowers toward light. That afternoon, she went for a walk through the park. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth. Children laughed in the distance. A breeze brushed her face, and she stopped by a bench beneath an old oak tree. Closing her eyes, she whispered, "This is what healing sounds like. No noise, no applause, just breath." In the days that followed, the resistance didn't vanish, but it lost its power. Whenever fear tried to speak, she answered with gratitude. When shame whispered, she replaced it with compassion. When her mind replayed the old narrative, divorced, forgotten, too late, she smiled softly and said, "No, just rewritten." One night, as thunder rolled far away, she sat by her window again, a soft lamp casting amber light across the room. She read a passage from Rhonda Byrne, "Your thoughts are the primary cause of everything." She closed the book and said aloud, "Then I choose thoughts that make me free." The storm outside began to fade. In the distance, the sky cracked open, revealing a thin silver moon. The sound of rain against the glass became rhythmic, almost musical. She exhaled, feeling something unclench inside her. Karen realized the war within her wasn't meant to destroy her. It was meant to teach her mastery. The old identity wasn't an enemy. It was a teacher, showing her where she still believed in limitation. The victory wasn't in silence, but in awareness. That night, she knelt beside her bed, resting her forehead on folded hands. "Thank you," she whispered, "not for taking the battle away, but for making me strong enough to face it." As she climbed into bed, she felt peace settle over her, not the loud kind that shouts victory, but the soft kind that simply knows. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The candle on her nightstand flickered one last time before going out, leaving a faint trace of smoke curling upward like prayer. For the first time in months, Karen fell asleep without fear, and in that silence, her mind, once her battlefield, became the sacred ground where faith was finally winning. The morning began with stillness, the kind of quiet that carried meaning. The window was open just enough for a soft breeze to move through the curtains, and the scent of rain lingered from the night before. Karen sat at the small wooden table that had become her altar, a candle, a Bible, her journal, and a cup of coffee that had gone untouched. The pages of her notebook fluttered slightly in the wind, as if urging her to begin. She had been thinking about this for days, how prayer sometimes felt too small for what her heart needed to say. There were words that didn't fit into the rhythm of spoken prayer, words that required ink, stillness, and surrender. So she picked up her pen, took a breath, and began to write a letter. Not to the universe, not to fate, but to God himself. "Dear God," she wrote, "I don't know what to ask for anymore. I don't know what's right or wrong, what to keep or what to release. But I know this. I'm tired of trying to understand everything. I just want peace. I want you to fill this space I've spent years trying to fill with approval, control, and fear. I give you the pieces I kept pretending were whole. I'm ready to see myself through your eyes." The words came slowly at first, then freely, pouring out like confession. Her tears fell onto the page, smudging some of the ink. She didn't stop. For the first time, she wasn't praying for an outcome. She was offering her heart. She paused, looking at the candlelight flickering across the paper. The sound of distant church bells drifted through the window. Her mind wandered to something Joseph Murphy had written. "When you pray, believe you have already received, and you will." That was faith, to act as if the answer was already here. so she shifted her tone. Thank you, God, for what you're already doing. Thank you for healing I can't yet see, for doors I haven't opened, for love I haven't met. Thank you for teaching me that endings are redirections. Thank you for reminding me that I am not forgotten. I am being formed. Her pen moved faster now. She wrote about her fears of aging alone, of rebuilding too late, of failing again. But with each sentence, the fear felt smaller, like smoke dissolving into the air. She ended the letter with a verse that had carried her through many nights. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. She signed the page with love, your daughter Karen, then folded the paper carefully and placed it inside her Bible. That night, something subtle changed. When she lay in bed, she didn't replay the usual memories. The courtroom, the silence, the loss. Her mind felt lighter, like a room finally cleared of dust. She dreamed of walking barefoot through a field of wildflowers, wind moving gently through her hair, sunlight warm against her face. In the dream, she wasn't running anymore. She was standing still, unafraid. When she woke the next morning, she felt that peace still lingering, soft, but real. She made tea and stood by the window as golden light touched her hands. You really heard me, didn't you? She whispered, smiling through tears. That afternoon, she walked to the park with her journal tucked under her arm. The air smelled of grass and honey. She found a quiet bench beneath a magnolia tree and began to read her letter aloud, softly enough that only God could hear. A few people passed by, an old couple holding hands, a child chasing a red balloon, but she didn't look up. Her voice trembled, then steadied. By the time she reached the end, she felt emptied and full at once. As she closed her notebook, a single magnolia petal drifted down and landed in her lap. She picked it up, smiling. It was pure white, smooth to the touch, delicate but whole. She took it as a sign. That evening, when she returned home, she didn't rush to turn on the lights. She moved through the quiet apartment slowly, intentionally. The air felt different, lighter, alive. She sat at her table, opened a clean page in her journal, and wrote 3 words that had become her truth. Faith feels safe. She looked around the room that had once felt empty and saw it differently now. The candlelight reflected off the window pane like small halos, and she realized that presence had been there all along, waiting for her to stop fighting and start listening. As the night deepened, she whispered one last prayer. If this is what surrender feels like, I don't ever want to live in control again. And in that quiet, somewhere between her heartbeat and her breath, peace answered back. The first sign came quietly. It wasn't a miracle in the sky or a sudden wind of revelation. It was a small moment on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of moment most people would overlook. Karen was walking home from the market, a paper bag tucked under her arm, when she noticed a little girl standing near the fountain, crying because her balloon had slipped away. The red balloon floated upward, a speck against the sky. For a second, Karen's heart ached. Then the girl's mother knelt beside her and said, "It's okay, sweetie. Another one will come." The child nodded, wiping her tears, and smiled again. Something inside Karen shifted. Another one will come. The phrase stayed with her all the way home, echoing softly in her chest. Faith, she thought, wasn't about forcing outcomes. It was about trusting replacements. She placed her groceries on the counter and stood there in the stillness, the sunlight spilling through the window, warm against her hands. The aroma of fresh basil filled the kitchen. She whispered, "You're teaching me through everything, aren't you?" The next few days unfolded with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Her mornings were still quiet, but no longer heavy. She would light her candle, open her journal, and breathe in gratitude, as naturally as air. She wrote phrases that felt more like frequencies than words. I am aligned. I am guided. I am safe. Each line carried a pulse, a vibration of belief that settled into her bones. When she walked slower. When she spoke, her tone softened. When she prayed, she no longer begged. She listened. That weekend, Grace invited her to the women's prayer group. Karen hesitated but went. The small fellowship room smelled of coffee and rain-soaked coats. The women sat in a circle, each one sharing stories of faith, heartbreak, and renewal. When it was Karen's turn, she didn't plan to speak much, but something within her opened. She told them about her divorce, her doubts, her letter to God. When she finished, silence filled the room. Not awkward, but reverent. Then one of the women, An older lady with kind eyes said, "Your pain has an echo, and it's reaching someone who needed your story." Tears streamed down Karen's cheeks. She realized faith was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to resonate. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Faith is not a request. It's a frequency. It's not about convincing God. It's about matching His peace." The days that followed confirmed it. She began noticing what she once would have dismissed as coincidence. A song on the radio that echoed her prayer from the night before. A stranger complimenting her smile on the street. A message from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. They were gentle reminders that alignment attracts alignment. She remembered a quote from Joe Dispenza. "When you change your energy, you change your life." It wasn't just metaphor. It was scripture in motion. Her prayers had changed because her energy had changed. On Sunday, as she sat by the window with her Bible open, she came across a verse that felt alive in her hands. "According to your faith, be it unto you." Matthew 9:29. She whispered it slowly, as if testing its vibration in the air. According to your faith, not your fear, not your past, not your status. Faith. She realized now that she had spent most of her life praying from lack, asking for what she didn't believe she could have. But the letter she'd written to God had shifted everything. She no longer prayed from emptiness. She prayed from fullness, gratitude, and expectancy. The frequency had changed, and so had the results. One morning, as she brewed coffee, she received an email from a woman named Evelyn, an editor for a local magazine. Evelyn had attended the prayer meeting weeks earlier and had been moved by Karen's story. "Would you be willing to share your journey in our feature on Women of Faith?" the message read. Karen froze, reading it twice. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a speaker. She was just a woman learning to rebuild. And yet, here was the opportunity she had written about, prayed about, and surrendered to. She smiled, whispering, "You really do answer in frequencies, don't you?" That night, she walked to the park again, journal in hand. The sky was painted in hues of lavender and gold. The sound of cicadas hummed in the background. She sat on her favorite bench beneath the magnolia tree and began to write. Not another letter of pain, but a declaration of gratitude. "Thank you, God, for showing me that faith is not noise, it's vibration. Thank you for proving that belief moves reality. I don't chase blessings anymore. I align with them." As she closed her journal, a gentle wind brushed her cheek, and for a moment, she could almost feel the presence of something unseen, like divine confirmation. On her way home, she passed the fountain again. A different child stood there this time, holding a red balloon tightly in both hands. Karen smiled as she walked by, whispering, "See, another one always comes." When she reached her apartment, the evening light filled the room like gold dust. She didn't light a candle that night. She didn't need to. The light was already within her, and as she sat quietly, hands folded in gratitude, she realized faith wasn't something she practiced anymore. It was something she had become. The magazine article came out 2 weeks later. On the cover, the headline read, "Faith After the Fall, How One Woman Found Strength in Surrender." Karen didn't recognize herself at first. The photo was simple. No makeup, no forced smile, just her sitting by the window with sunlight on her face. Yet it was the most honest image she'd ever seen of herself. When she held the printed copy in her hands, the paper smelled faintly of ink and something new. Possibility. For years, she had looked for validation through others' eyes, but this time the reflection was her own. She felt no pride, only peace. That morning, she walked to her favorite cafe downtown. The soft hum of conversation, the aroma of roasted coffee beans, and the clinking of porcelain cups formed a kind of music. She sat by the window with her journal, noticing how people moved, rushed, distracted, unaware of the quiet miracles happening in ordinary moments. A woman at the next table recognized her from the article. "You're Karen, right?" she asked, smiling. "I read your story. It gave me so much hope." Karen's eyes softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm. "Hope is contagious. Pass it on." When she walked home, she realized how different her posture felt. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of proving herself. Her steps no longer echoed the rhythm of survival. Something inside her had realigned, like her bones remembered their rightful place. That evening, she stood before the mirror, not to criticize, but to bless. The soft light from the lamp framed her face in gold. The lines around her eyes told the story of laughter and loss, but they no longer spoke of defeat. She whispered, "I forgive you, for shrinking, for doubting, for waiting on permission to exist." She remembered a line from Joseph Murphy, "The only thing that can stop your destiny is your own self-concept." For years, she had believed her worth depended on being chosen, by a husband, a job, a world that measured value in productivity and youth. But now she understood. Self-worth was not earned, it was remembered. Her journal became a sacred dialogue, each page a mirror, each word a step back to herself. She wrote, "I am not what I lost. I am what I kept when everything else was gone." The next morning, she spent hours cleaning her apartment, opening windows, letting sunlight in. She played soft piano music and brewed lavender tea. The scent drifted through the rooms like grace. When she finished, she sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that love begins here." That same afternoon, she received a call from Grace, her friend from church. "We're organizing a women's workshop next month," Grace said. "Would you be willing to speak about healing after loss?" Karen hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling slightly. The old version of her would have declined, citing fear or unworthiness. But this new woman, this version sculpted by faith and fire, smiled and said, "Yes, I'd love to." After the call, she sat by the window, heart racing with quiet excitement. The magnolia tree outside was beginning to bloom again. The air smelled of rain and renewal. She realized she had become what she once prayed for, a living example of restoration. That evening, she opened her Bible, and her eyes fell on a verse she hadn't read in years. "She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come." Proverbs 31:25. For the first time, the verse didn't feel distant or aspirational. It felt like a mirror. The night was still. A faint breeze moved through the curtains, carrying the scent of jasmine. She lit a candle and wrote one last line before bed. "My worth was never lost. It was waiting for me to remember who I am." As she closed her journal, she felt a quiet joy rise from somewhere deep, a knowing that no circumstance, no man, no mistake could ever define her again. She was not rebuilding her life, she was reclaiming it. When she turned off the lights, the reflection of the candle still glowed faintly in the glass, like a small reminder. The light she sought had always been within her, and as she drifted to sleep, she knew this truth with certainty. When a woman finally believes she is enough, heaven calls it a victory. It started with a single bill that arrived in the mail, a reminder that her rent was due in 5 days. In the past, that envelope would have triggered panic. She would have felt the familiar tension in her chest, the spiral of, "What if I can't? And how will I survive?" But this time, Karen placed the letter on the table, lit her candle, and whispered, "God, you've brought me this far. I trust you'll handle this too." For the first time in her life, she didn't rush into fear. She breathed. Later that evening, she sat on the floor surrounded by her journals and open books. The words of Bob Proctor echoed in her mind. "Money is energy, and it responds to your vibration." She traced the sentence with her finger, feeling its weight. For years, she had treated money like an adversary, something distant, scarce, and conditional. But if it was energy, then it was not moral or immoral. It simply responded to belief. She opened her Bible and found the verse that would redefine her understanding. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." On Psalm 23, "Not I might not want. Not one day I won't want. I shall not want." Those words filled the room like light. She whispered them again and again until the syllables felt like heartbeat. She began practicing what she called faith accounting. Every morning she would sit with her coffee and list what she already had: peace, health, strength, the ability to create. She began to see that abundance wasn't limited to money. It was sunlight on her skin, the laughter of a stranger, the taste of warm bread. It was everything she had once overlooked. Slowly, something inside her rewired. Gratitude replaced scarcity. Expectancy replaced anxiety. That week, she received an unexpected phone call. A woman from the magazine wanted to commission her for a series of articles about spiritual transformation. "Your story resonated deeply," the editor said. "We'd love to feature your reflections as a column." Karen's breath caught. Writing had been her therapy, her prayer. Now it was becoming her provision. "I'd be honored," she replied, tears forming quietly. That night, she made a simple dinner: roasted vegetables, rice, and a small glass of wine. The aroma of rosemary filled the kitchen. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that gratitude itself was wealth. After dinner, she sat at her table, opened her journal, and wrote, "Money doesn't change who I am. It amplifies who I already am. I am not chasing it. I am aligning with the frequency of enough." She remembered something Rhonda Byrne had written. When you feel rich, you attract richness. It wasn't arrogance. It was alignment. She didn't need to beg the universe for provision. She needed to believe she was already provided for. In the days that followed, she began to treat every transaction as a prayer. When she paid a bill, she said, "Thank you for the ability to give." When she received money, she said, "Thank you for trusting me with more." Every dollar became evidence of divine circulation, never lost, only moving. Her perspective changed so completely that even small miracles began to appear. A client paid her earlier than expected. An old friend sent a gift card just because. The local cafe owner offered her free coffee after reading her article. None of it was coincidence. It was confirmation. One evening, while journaling by candlelight, she reflected on something she had learned from Joseph Murphy. Your subconscious mind is the treasury of your future. She smiled, realizing she had finally stopped praying from lack. She was now co-creating with heaven. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm. "This sound," she whispered, "is what provision feels like. Constant, gentle, always arriving." She opened her Bible once more, her eyes falling on Philippians 4:19. "And my God will supply all your needs according to his riches in glory." She read it out loud, letting each word settle deep within her spirit. "All your needs," she repeated. "Not some, not someday. All." Later that week, she went to the park for a walk. The magnolia tree was blooming again, its petals spreading fragrance into the air. She stood beneath it, eyes closed, palms open. "I receive," she whispered, not with desperation, but with certainty. The sunlight filtered through the branches, warm against her face. She smiled, knowing that abundance wasn't coming from outside. It was rising from within. That night, as she wrote in her journal before bed, she summarized the revelation that had changed everything. "Money isn't the reward for my faith, it's the reflection of it." She closed the notebook, blew out the candle, and felt peace wash through her like light through water. In that stillness, she understood the truth at the heart of her journey. Abundance wasn't something she was waiting to receive. It was something she had finally learned to remember. And as she drifted into sleep, she whispered one last phrase into the quiet room, words that felt like both prayer and promise. "I shall not want." It was a Sunday morning when Karen decided to visit her hometown. The road stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted with pale gold and soft clouds. As she drove past the familiar fields and quiet houses, a strange mix of peace and tension filled her chest. She hadn't been back since the divorce. The air smelled of soil and nostalgia, carrying memories she thought she had buried for good. Her parents still lived in the same white house at the edge of town, the one with blue shutters and a front porch full of plants her mother still tended every morning. When Karen stepped out of the car, her mother opened the door before she could knock. "You're thinner," her mother said, pulling her into a hug. "Are you eating?" Karen smiled softly. "I'm living," she answered, and her mother didn't quite know what to make of that. The house looked the same, yet everything inside her felt different. The walls carried the scent of cinnamon and furniture polish. The same framed photos lined the hallway. Her wedding, her college graduation, her parents' anniversary. Each picture felt like a ghost of a life she no longer inhabited. At lunch, her father asked about her work, his tone careful. "I read that article," he said, "about faith and starting over. It's good, but you're really making a living from that?" There it was, the question she had always feared, the one that measured worth by logic and stability. She took a breath. "Yes, Dad. I'm writing, teaching, and helping women rebuild. It's not what I used to do, but it feels right." He nodded slowly, not in disapproval, but in uncertainty. "Just be careful. Faith is good, but you can't rely on it to pay the bills." Karen looked at him with calm eyes. "It already has." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was revelation. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to convince anyone of her choices. She realized that the blueprint she had inherited, the one that equated safety with control and success with sacrifice, wasn't hers anymore. That night, after everyone went to bed, she stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cool and carried the faint smell of rain-soaked earth. She looked at the stars, countless, endless, unafraid of shining. She whispered, I'm not who I was raised to be. I'm who I was created to be. She remembered a quote from Bob Proctor that had once confused her. You were born rich. Now she understood. He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about identity. She thought of all the times she had played small to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. A daughter who obeyed, a wife who endured, a woman who apologized for wanting more. That blueprint had been etched deep, like lines carved into stone. But faith, she realized, was the chisel that set her free. Before leaving the next morning, her mother handed her a small envelope. I've been saving this for you, she said. Inside was a folded piece of paper, an old note Karen had written to herself at 16. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. One day I'll help people find their light. Tears filled her eyes. You kept this? Her mother nodded. I always knew you would. On the drive home, Karen played soft instrumental music and let the wind move through her hair. Every mile between the old house and her new life felt like shedding another layer of the past. She whispered, Thank you for the blueprint you've been drawing all along. That afternoon, back in her apartment, she opened her journal and wrote a single sentence in bold letters. I no longer build from fear. I build from faith. She lit her candle and opened her Bible to 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. She read it aloud and smiled through tears. Yes, the new is here. The next day, she began designing something that had been on her heart for months, a workshop for women who had lost everything and didn't know how to start again. She called it Faith Rewritten. She planned each session like a story, the power of surrender, the science of belief, the rhythm of gratitude. Her pain had become her curriculum. When she held the first gathering in a small community center, only 8 women came. But as she looked at their faces, she saw versions of herself, fearful, hopeful, ready. She spoke not as a teacher, but as a witness. She told them, the moment you stop fighting the old version of you, the new one finally has space to breathe. By the time the session ended, tears and laughter mingled in the room. One woman said, I didn't come here to learn. I came here to remember. That night, Karen walked home under a sky full of stars, her steps slow, her spirit steady. She knew she had broken more than an old pattern. She had broken the inheritance of limitation. When she reached home, she stood before her mirror once more. Her reflection smiled back with quiet strength. She whispered, I'm no longer my past's daughter. I am my future's mother. And in that single sentence, the last wall of her old blueprint crumbled, leaving behind only light. It began as a quiet thought, one she almost dismissed the moment it appeared. A house. Not just any house, but one filled with sunlight, laughter, and warmth. A place that would hold her story in its walls and echo peace through its rooms. She had written about it months before in her journal, describing every detail. The white curtains, the scent of baked bread, the sound of rain against wide windows. She didn't know why she wrote it then, but now something told her it was time. Karen sat at her small kitchen table, sipping tea while the morning light streamed through the window. She remembered something Rhonda Byrne had said. When you feel as though you already have it, the universe rearranges itself for you. She smiled faintly. Maybe that was what faith looked like, feeling the miracle before seeing it. That afternoon, she walked through a quiet neighborhood she had never visited before. The air smelled of blooming lilacs, and the sidewalks shimmered under late spring sunlight. She wasn't house hunting. She was simply walking, listening. As she passed a row of old homes, one caught her eye. It was modest, with white shutters, ivy climbing the porch, and light spilling through the front windows as though the house itself was alive. A for sale sign leaned slightly in the yard. Karen stopped. Something in her chest fluttered. Not excitement, not fear, but recognition. It's you, she whispered, almost laughing at herself. That evening, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself it was impossible. The numbers wouldn't add up. The timing wasn't right. But her spirit refused to agree. She remembered the verse she had underlined so many times it was nearly fading from her Bible. Nothing will be impossible with God. Luke 1:37. The next morning, she called the number on the sign. The realtor, a gentle-voiced woman named Ellen, agreed to meet her that afternoon. When Karen walked through the doorway, sunlight spilled across the wooden floors like gold. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and cedar. Every corner felt familiar, as if her soul had walked there long before her feet did. Ellen spoke about square footage and price, but Karen barely heard. Her attention was drawn to the kitchen window, where the light filtered in exactly as she had imagined in her journal. It illuminated the space with a warmth that felt divine. When they reached the living room, Ellen smiled. This house has been waiting for the right person. Everyone loves it, but no one seems to connect enough to make an offer. Karen laughed softly. Maybe it was waiting for Faith to walk through the door. That night, she sat at her table, candle flickering, papers spread out before her. Logically, it made no sense. Her savings weren't enough for a full down payment. But logic had stopped being her god a long time ago. She placed her hand over the paperwork and prayed aloud. If this is part of your plan, I'll trust the steps, even when I can't see the staircase. Days passed, and she held her peace like armor. Instead of worrying, she practiced gratitude for what was already hers in spirit. She walked around her small apartment saying, "Thank you for my home. Thank you for the sunlight. Thank you for the promise." A week later, Ellen called. "I don't know how to explain this," she said, "but the owner just reduced the price, and your financing was approved faster than I've ever seen. You got the house, Karen." Karen froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "Thank you," she whispered through sobs. "You did it again." The day she received the keys, the sky was clear, and the air smelled of fresh rain. She stood at the threshold, hand trembling on the doorknob, whispering, "God, let this place be a sanctuary." When she opened the door, light flooded the hallway as though heaven itself had accepted the invitation. She spent the afternoon cleaning and unpacking, moving slowly, reverently. She placed her candle on the kitchen counter, her Bible by the window, her journal on a wooden table beside a vase of white lilies. Each item carried history, each placement meaning. As the sun began to set, she brewed coffee and sat on the porch. The light wrapped the house in amber tones. Neighbors passed by, waving kindly. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes sang softly in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, she felt rooted, not because she owned something, but because she belonged somewhere. The walls didn't feel empty. They hummed with peace. Later that night, she walked through the house barefoot, the wooden floors cool under her feet. She whispered gratitude in every room. "Thank you for this kitchen. Thank you for this light. Thank you for this chapter." When she reached the bedroom, she stood before the window and watched the moonlight spill across the bed. She remembered something Joseph Murphy had written. "Your subconscious mind is the builder of your body and your circumstances." She smiled, realizing that her faith had built this, not as a reward, but as reflection. Before sleeping, she wrote in her journal, "A house built on fear will collapse, but a home built on faith becomes light." She placed her pen down, turned off the lamp, and lay in bed as moonlight glowed across the walls. The air was still, soft, sacred, and as she drifted into sleep, the last words she whispered were the ones she had written months ago, words that now lived in wood and window, in roof and air. "Thank you for my house full of light." For weeks, Karen lived wrapped in a quiet joy. Every sunrise through the kitchen window felt like a benediction. Every echo in the empty hallway a hymn. She filled her home with soft music, candles, and laughter from new friends who came to share coffee and prayer. It was peace, the kind she had dreamed of when she wrote that first letter to God. But as quickly as the calm had come, another season began to stir, a slower, heavier one. It started with silence. Opportunities that once flowed easily stopped arriving. Her writing work paused without warning, payments delayed, emails unanswered. The same house that had felt like abundance now echoed with the tension of waiting. At first she brushed it off. "Maybe it's just a slow month," she told herself. But when another week passed, then two, she felt the familiar tug of anxiety in her chest. She sat on the floor one evening, bills spread before her like small trials of faith. The candle on the table flickered low, its flame trembling in the draft. "God," she whispered, "you gave me this home. I know you wouldn't bring me here just to watch me lose it. But what do you want me to do now?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, almost tangible. It filled the room like a presence that spoke without words. She thought of Isaiah 30:15. "In quietness and trust shall be your strength." Quietness, trust. Two things her old self had never mastered. The next morning, she walked through the park, the air crisp and cool. The magnolia tree had shed its last flowers, and the ground was scattered with fading petals. Nature, she realized, was never in a hurry. The tree wasn't dying. It was preparing for something unseen. Back home, she made tea and opened her Bible to Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. She underlined the words in its time. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't that God was silent. He was scheduling beauty. That week, she decided to stop forcing and start listening. Each morning, instead of praying for results, she prayed for revelation. "Show me what this waiting is for," she said softly. The answer didn't come in thunder. It came in stillness. She began to notice small lessons in the pause. When she walked her neighborhood, she noticed the slow rhythm of life, the mailman's careful steps, the wind rustling leaves, a mother teaching her child to tie his shoes. Nothing rushed, yet everything moved. Waiting, she realized, wasn't punishment. It was alignment. Still, there were nights when fear crept back. She would lie awake staring at the ceiling, mind racing with what-ifs. On one of those nights, she reached for her journal and wrote, "Faith is easy when doors open. It's sacred when nothing moves." She set the pen down, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I'll wait well." The next day, she met Grace for coffee. Grace listened quietly as Karen explained her struggle. "Maybe God isn't testing you," Grace said softly. "Maybe he's teaching you how to receive without control." Those words landed deep. Karen smiled weakly. "That's always been the hardest part for me." Grace reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You're learning. Don't mistake silence for absence. Even the seed rests before it grows." That night, Karen sat on her porch wrapped in a shawl, the scent of rain drifting through the air. Fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns in the garden. She thought about the seasons of her life, the rushing, the striving, the grasping, and how this new phase, though uncertain, carried a strange peace. "When you said wait," she whispered to the night, "you weren't withholding. You were preparing." A sense of calm settled over her, as gentle as the wind that brushed her hair. The candle beside her flickered in rhythm with her heartbeat. Days turned to weeks, and slowly, she noticed subtle shifts. An unexpected email from a woman she'd helped months ago. A new client referral. Small signs, like divine breadcrumbs, leading her forward. But this time she didn't chase them. She followed them with grace, not urgency. One afternoon, as she organized her desk, she found an old note she had written in her first journal. "Faith is trusting God even when nothing makes sense." She smiled, realizing she had written her own prophecy. That evening, she brewed coffee and sat by her window. The setting sun filled the room with soft gold, touching everything it reached. She opened her Bible one last time and read Isaiah 40:31. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles." Karen closed her eyes and whispered, "Then I'll wait with wings." Outside, the last light of day shimmered across her garden. The air smelled of rain and soil, alive, expectant. She took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. Waiting no longer felt like stillness. It felt like becoming. And as the first stars appeared above her house full of light, she finally understood. The promise wasn't delayed. It was simply unfolding on divine time. The season of waiting ended not with a grand event, but with a phone call. A local women's organization had read Karen's articles and wanted her to speak at their annual retreat, an event focused on renewal after loss. "We need someone who's lived what she teaches," the coordinator said. "Someone whose story carries peace." Karen hesitated. For years she had been the listener, the writer, the quiet vessel. Speaking felt different, exposed. But that night, as she prayed in her living room, the answer rose within her like breath itself. "You are not here to hide your healing. You're here to share it." The morning of the event arrived clear and calm. She drove through rolling hills bathed in sunrise, the world glowing in shades of gold and rose. The air smelled of dew and pine. When she reached the retreat center, she stood outside for a moment, breathing deeply, her palms slightly trembling. "Use me," she whispered. "Make my story a mirror for theirs." Inside, the room buzzed softly with anticipation. Dozens of women filled the space, some holding notebooks, others tissues, all carrying invisible weights. Karen stepped onto the small stage, the light warm on her face. For a heartbeat, she felt the old fear again, the urge to shrink, to let someone else speak. But then she remembered her journal entry from months ago. "Faith feels safe." She smiled. "I used to think I lost everything," she began, her voice steady. "But I see now. I didn't lose. I was cleared. God removed what was never meant to stay so he could make room for what was always mine. The room grew silent. She spoke of surrender, of reprogramming belief, of blending faith with action. She quoted Joseph Murphy, "Your subconscious mind is the garden of your life. Plant wisely." She told them how she once planted fear, and how faith had taught her to plant gratitude instead. As she spoke, something changed. Tears streamed down faces. Laughter broke through sobs. It wasn't performance, it was resonance. Each story she shared became a key unlocking someone else's heart. During the final prayer, she asked everyone to close their eyes. "Say this with me," she whispered. "I am not a victim of life. I am a vessel of light." The women repeated it softly, voices overlapping like a quiet wave. The atmosphere thickened with peace, the kind that makes time stand still. Afterward, one woman approached her, shaking. "I was going to give up," she said, tears in her eyes. "But when you said I am the vessel, something in me woke up." Karen embraced her, whispering, "Then that was the reason I came." Driving home that evening, the road shimmered beneath the soft light of sunset. The world felt renewed, like creation itself was whispering, "Well done." She realized that becoming the blessing wasn't about perfection or platform. It was about presence, being willing to stand where you once fell, and show others that healing is real. When she reached her house, she didn't turn on the lights right away. The twilight filled the rooms with a gentle amber glow. She placed her Bible on the kitchen table and wrote in her journal, "I used to ask God to bless me. Now I ask him to make me a blessing." Later that week, she received more invitations to speak. Small churches, online summits, women's groups. Each time, she said yes, not from ambition, but obedience. Every time she stood before others, she felt the same quiet presence guiding her words, reminding her, this was never about fame, it was about faith multiplied. One evening, after another talk, she returned home to find a letter in her mailbox. It was handwritten, the paper scented faintly of lavender. Inside were just 3 lines. "Your words found me when I couldn't find myself. You showed me that God still writes new stories. Thank you for being proof." Karen held the letter to her heart, tears forming again. Proof, that was all she ever wanted to be. Proof that surrender leads to restoration, that faith rewires what fear once destroyed, that pain, when placed in God's hands, becomes purpose. As night settled, she stepped onto her porch, the air cool and fragrant. Fireflies glimmered above the garden like small prayers taking flight. She whispered, "Thank you for letting me become what I once prayed for." The wind moved gently through the trees, almost like a reply, and beneath that vast, forgiving sky, Karen understood the truth that completed her transformation. The greatest blessing isn't receiving light. It's realizing you were born to carry it. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Ordinary, quiet, like most miracles are. Karen was at a small cafe downtown, working on her next article. The place smelled of cinnamon and roasted coffee, sunlight spilling through tall windows and golden ribbons. She was lost in thought, typing about faith and transformation, when a man approached her table. "Excuse me," he said, smiling. "Are you Karen Mitchell? I think I heard you speak at the women's retreat last month." She looked up, surprised. His voice was calm, gentle, carrying the warmth of someone who had been through storms and learned to walk slowly. "Yes," she replied, slightly uncertain. "That was me." He nodded. "I'm Daniel. My sister attended your session. She couldn't stop talking about it. She said you helped her believe again." He paused, then added softly, "So I wanted to thank you for helping her find peace." Karen smiled, humbled. "I didn't give her peace. She found what was already there." Daniel sat at the next table, coffee in hand, and they began to talk. Not about miracles or theology, just life, about books, quiet mornings, the strange comfort of rain. She noticed his eyes carried kindness without agenda, and laughter came easily between pauses. When she left the cafe, she thought little of it. But later that night, while washing dishes, she found herself smiling for no reason at all. Days passed, then weeks. They met again, first by coincidence, then by choice. Walks in the park turned into long talks about purpose and pain, about how both shape faith differently for men and women. Daniel was a widower. He spoke of loss without bitterness, of learning to rebuild. "God took my wife home early," he said once, eyes soft, "but he didn't take my capacity to love." Something in those words disarmed her. Still, Karen was cautious. She had spent years rebuilding from the ashes of heartbreak. She didn't want to lose herself in another rescue disguised as romance. So she prayed, not for a sign, but for discernment. "God," she whispered one evening, "if this is meant to bloom, let it grow slowly, like spring. No rush, no forcing." And that's exactly how it happened. They began meeting for coffee every week. Sometimes they spoke for hours, sometimes they sat in silence, simply watching people pass by. There was no pressure, no pretending, only presence. With him, she didn't have to be the teacher, the speaker, the woman of faith. She could simply be Karen, the woman who loved books, quiet music, and the smell of rain. One afternoon, while walking by the magnolia tree, Daniel turned to her and said, "You know what I see when I look at you? Peace. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that grew from it." Tears filled her eyes. "It took me a long time to learn that peace doesn't mean everything's perfect. It means I stopped fighting what I couldn't control." He smiled. "That's the most beautiful kind of strength." Over time, she realized that love wasn't returning to fill an emptiness. It was arriving because she had finally made room. She thought of Ephesians 3:20. "Now to him, who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine." She whispered it one night as they sat on her porch beneath the stars. The air was cool, scented with jasmine. Daniel reached for her hand, not as a claim but as a question. She didn't pull away. For a moment, she felt time pause, the moonlight brushing her skin, the faint hum of crickets, the rhythm of two heartbeats finding harmony. She wasn't falling in love, she was recognizing it. Later that night, after he left, she stood by the window watching the road disappear into the distance. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, radiant. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You said everything would bloom in its time." The next morning, she wrote in her journal, "Love doesn't rescue me. It reflects me. It came when I no longer needed it to prove I was whole." Weeks later, Daniel helped her plant a small garden beside her porch. They worked in silence, hands covered in earth, laughter soft between breaths. When they finished, Karen looked at the soil and said, "Everything starts in the dirt, doesn't it? Even beauty." Daniel nodded. "Even faith." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Karen walked through her house full of light, and realized that love had not entered her story as a climax. It had entered as confirmation, proof that when you heal, you don't attract rescue, you attract reflection. She stood before her window, sunset glowing across her face, and whispered one last truth that felt like both prayer and gratitude. "When I learned to love my waiting, love found me waiting in peace." The morning of her 53rd birthday began with light, the kind that doesn't just touch the skin, but seeps quietly into the soul. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, dancing across the table where her Bible, her candle, and her journal still rested in their familiar places. The air smelled faintly of coffee and lilies from the bouquet Daniel had brought the night before. Karen sat down, pen in hand, the same way she had done for years. But today, she didn't write to ask or to heal. She wrote to remember. 5 years ago today, she began, "I was a woman signing divorce papers under a gray sky, wondering if my life was over. I thought love had abandoned me, purpose had expired, and faith was too silent to matter. But what I couldn't see then was that heaven wasn't rejecting me. It was redirecting me." Her handwriting flowed steadily, each line a reflection of the transformation she had lived. She paused for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the sound of life continuing softly around her. The once empty house now carried music, laughter, and warmth, an orchestra of quiet miracles. She thought of her workshops, now reaching hundreds of women, of the letters that arrived weekly from readers who had found hope in her words, of the magazine column that had turned into a best-selling devotional book titled Faith Rewritten. She smiled, running her fingers across the cover that sat beside her coffee cup. The words of Joe Dispenza came to mind. "When you change your energy, you change your life." She had lived it, not as theory but as truth. Every chapter of her story had been a shift in frequency, from pain to peace, from striving to surrender, from scarcity to abundance. She rose from the table and stepped outside to the porch. The morning air was cool, sweet with the scent of dew and earth. Her garden bloomed in soft colors, lavender, white roses, and magnolia blossoms stretching toward the sun. The same magnolia tree that had once symbolized endings now stood as a monument of renewal. Daniel joined her moments later, 2 cups of coffee in hand. His smile carried the same quiet certainty that had once steadied her heart. "Happy birthday." he said. She took the cup and laughed softly. It feels different this year. How so? It feels complete. They sat in silence for a while, watching a pair of doves land on the fence. The world around them moved slowly, peacefully, like time itself was in prayer. Karen turned to him. You know what I've learned? She said. That empowerment isn't about strength the way the world defines it. It's not about independence or control. It's about peace, the kind of peace that doesn't depend on anything staying the same. Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the morning light. You found what most people spend a lifetime chasing. She smiled. I stopped chasing. Later that afternoon, she gathered with friends from her church, women from her workshops, and neighbors who had become family. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter. Someone played soft music on the piano. Someone else prayed a blessing over her life. There was no grandeur, just gratitude. When everyone left, she stood in her living room, quiet again. The sunlight had turned golden, casting warm streaks across the floor. She felt that familiar presence, the same one that had carried her through every dark night and silent season. She whispered, "Thank you, for every detour, every delay, every unanswered prayer that became protection." Her eyes fell on the old journal she had kept through the years. She opened it to the first page, the one where she had written, "Divorced at 48, empowered at 53. She laughed softly. "You kept your promise," she said aloud. Outside, the day gave way to dusk. The sky blushed with pink and gold, fading into the first stars. She stepped out onto the porch one last time, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The world was still, and her heart matched its rhythm. She closed her eyes and spoke the words that had guided her entire journey. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah 29:11. As the breeze moved gently through her garden, Karen smiled, peaceful, whole, free. She was no longer the woman who had once prayed for a new life. She was the woman who had become the answer to that prayer. And as the last light of day faded into night, her house, her heart, remained full of light.